Royal history is filled with dark stories, but few are as tangled and chilling as the one that unfolds in the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. The Tower of London, today a landmark. But in 1483, it was something far more menacing, both a royal palace and a terrifying prison. In that summer, two young boys, a king who hadn't even been crowned and his younger brother, were brought there, supposedly for their own safety. People saw them playing in the gardens, their laughter a strange sound against the ancient stone walls. And then, nothing. This isn't just a disappearance. It's English history's coldest case, a story born from the sudden death of a king, culminating in a historical enigma that has baffled generations. At the center of it all are two children, a boy who was king for just 86 days, and his little brother. They were princes, the future of their dynasty, and they were the only thing standing between their uncle and the throne of England. And then, they were just gone. For more than 500 years, one question has echoed through history. Were they murdered by the very man who swore to protect them? To get why two princes could just disappear, you have to understand the world they were born into. 15th century England. This place was a mess, torn apart for decades by a brutal civil war for the throne that we now call the Wars of the Roses. It was a fight between two branches of the same family, the House of Lancaster with its red rose and the House of York with its white rose. For 30 years, the crown was a bloody prize, snatched back and forth through battles, betrayals, and assassinations. The throne wasn't just a seat of power. It was a target on your back where your closest relative could easily be your most dangerous enemy. The figure who finally brought a semblance of order was King Edward IV, a charismatic and tough-as-nails warrior from the House of York. He grabbed the throne in 1461, lost it, then won it back for good in 1471. For the next 12 years, Edward ruled with a firm hand and brought some much-needed peace. But he was also hiding a secret that would eventually cause a whole new wave of conflict. Years earlier, Edward had secretly married a commoner, a beautiful widow named Elizabeth Woodville. In an age where royal marriages were basically business deals, marrying for love was a scandal. Marrying someone with no royal blood and a ton of ambitious relatives was seen as political suicide. The Woodville family went from nobodies to the top of the food chain overnight, which made the old-school aristocrats, including the king's own brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, furious. This split the court in two. You had the queen and her massive family, the Woodvilles, on one side, and the old guard, the powerful nobles like Richard, on the other. As long as Edward IV was alive, his big personality kept a lid on all this tension, but everyone knew the peace was fragile. It all depended on one man's life. In April 1483, the unthinkable happened. King Edward IV, only 40 years old, got sick and died. His death sent a shockwave through the kingdom. All the stability he'd built just crumbled. England's future now rested on the shoulders of his oldest son, also named Edward, who was just 12 years old. A boy king was always a recipe for disaster, given the ripe opportunities for power struggles and abuse among regencies with dishonorable motivations. The new king, Edward V, was at Ludlow Castle with his mother's family. His younger brother, 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, was in London with their mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville. The plan was for Edward to travel to London for his coronation, but the two factions at court began a mad dash for control of the boy. On one side, the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Woodville, planned to rule through her son. On the other was the boy's uncle, their father's youngest and most loyal brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. When Edward IV died, his will named brother Richard as Lord Protector of the realm, meaning he was supposed to run England until the boy was old enough to rule. Richard, along with another powerful noble, the Duke of Buckingham, intercepted the young king's group at a town called Stony Stratford. He arrested the king's Woodville escort and took control of the boy himself, claiming he was saving his nephew from a conspiracy. When Queen Elizabeth Woodville heard the news, she panicked and fled with her other children into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Richard brought Edward V to London and moved him into the Tower of London. At the time, this wasn't necessarily sinister. The Tower was a royal palace where kings traditionally stayed before their coronation. But Richard needed the king's brother. Through the intervention of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Richard managed to persuade the distraught queen to surrender her younger son, ostensibly for the boy to join his brother. In mid-June 1483, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, was taken to join Edward in the Tower. Now, Richard of Gloucester had both of his nephews locked away in a fortress that he completely controlled. With both princes inside, the mood in London became incredibly tense. A date was set for Edward V's coronation, June 22nd, but the day came and went with no ceremony. Instead, priests suddenly started giving sermons claiming that the two princes were illegitimate. The argument was a bombshell. Their father, King Edward IV, had supposedly promised to marry another woman before he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. Under church law, that meant his marriage was invalid, and all their children were bastards with no claim to the throne. This was formalized in a document called Titulus Regius. With the princes legally stripped of their titles, the next in line was Richard, Duke of Gloucester. On July 6, 1483, he was crowned King Richard III. After Richard became king, the boys were seen less and less. The last credible sighting of the princes alive was sometime in the summer of 1483. After that, a deep and terrifying silence. They were never seen again. Rumors started flying almost immediately. By the fall of that year, whispers that the princes had been murdered were spreading not just through England, but all the way to France. The new king was under a dark cloud of suspicion, sparking a mystery that has led to multiple suspects and competing theories. Theory 1. The prime suspect, King Richard III. In any investigation, the first question you ask is, who benefits? The answer points straight to the new King Richard III. He had the clearest motive. As long as those princes were alive, they were a threat. Even if declared illegitimate, they were still the sons of a popular king and could become symbols for rebellion. Their deaths would eliminate that threat for good. He also had the means and opportunity. As king, he had total control over the Tower of London, where the boys were last seen in his care. The most famous account blaming Richard comes from Sir Thomas More, who wrote decades later that Richard sent a loyal servant, Sir James Tyrrell, to have the princes killed. According to More, two assassins smothered the sleeping boys with their pillows. This story, immortalized by William Shakespeare, has cemented Richard's guilt in the public mind. Recently, new research suggests More had direct connections to the circles of those alleged to have carried out the deed, personally knowing the sons of one of the alleged murderers. Even more startling is a will from 1516 belonging to a woman whose son possessed a chain that had belonged to the young King Edward V. This woman was the sister-in-law of Sir James Tyrrell, the man More accused of masterminding the murder. But the case against Richard isn't a slam dunk. There is no direct contemporary evidence. All detailed accounts were written decades later under the Tudor dynasty, which had every reason to paint Richard, the man they overthrew, as a child-killing monster. Richard's defenders argued the disappearance actually made his throne shakier, fueling rebellions against him. Theory 2. The ally-turned-rebel, the Duke of Buckingham. Richard III wasn't the only powerful man with access to the princes. Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham, was Richard's right-hand man during the coup. He was showered with land and titles, making him the most powerful man in England besides the king. The theory is that Buckingham might have acted on his own, killing the princes to secure the new regime and his own powerful position. A more sinister theory suggests that since Buckingham had his own distant claim to the throne, getting rid of the princes might have been the first move in a play for the crown himself. The evidence? Just 3 months after helping Richard become king, Buckingham led a massive rebellion against him. Why the sudden betrayal? We don't know. Perhaps he became disillusioned with Richard III's ability to reign, or maybe his ambitions simply grew too large. In any event, he was captured and executed and never officially accused of the murder. Theory 3. The ultimate winner, Henry VII. This theory takes a surprising turn, suggesting the man who benefited most was Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII. It hinges on the possibility that the princes actually survived Richard III's reign. Henry's claim to the throne was weak. After he defeated Richard in 1485, he married the prince's older sister, Elizabeth of York, to unite the warring families. But that union depended on her brothers being dead. If either prince were still alive, they would have a much stronger claim. During Henry's reign, a young man named Perkin Warbeck appeared, claiming to be the younger prince, Richard. Due to his striking resemblance to Edward IV's family and his detailed knowledge of court life, he was convincing enough to get support from European rulers and was a major threat for years. Henry VII captured him and branded him an impostor who later confessed. If Warbeck was the real prince, then Henry VII would have been the one who ultimately killed a rightful heir to secure his own dynasty. Theory 4. The survival theory. The idea that the boys escaped fuels the most hopeful theories. Richard III's failure to produce their bodies created a cloud of uncertainty. Some researchers, like those in the Missing Princes Project, argue that Richard may have spared his nephews and sent them into hiding. This theory gets its fuel from the pretenders like Perkin Warbeck. Proponents claim to have found documents in European archives that they believe are proof of life, suggesting the boys lived past 1483. However, the vast majority of historians are skeptical, arguing there is no irrefutable proof, and the documents are open to interpretation. The physical evidence, the skeletons in the tower. In 1674, nearly 200 years after the princes disappeared, workmen demolishing a staircase in the Tower of London found a wooden chest with the skeletons of 2 small children inside. Everyone assumed they were the princes' remains, given their age and location. The bones were placed in an urn and buried in Westminster Abbey, with an inscription identifying them as the victims of their perfidious Uncle Richard. But in 1933, an examination of the bones concluded they belonged to 2 boys of the right age, though the science was primitive, and researchers at the time were unable to definitively determine the exact age or gender of the remains. Today, radiocarbon dating and DNA analysis could potentially solve the mystery. Historians have even traced the prince's mitochondrial DNA to a living relative, meaning a comparison is possible. If the DNA matches, it proves the bones belong to the princes. If it doesn't, it reopens the door to survival theories. But the remains are under the control of the monarch, and permission to test them has not been granted. The most important piece of physical evidence remains locked away. We've looked back over 500 years into a world of raw ambition and betrayal. We have put the key suspects on the stand and looked at their motives, means, and opportunities. The case against the prime suspect, King Richard III, is strong. And yet, there's still reasonable doubt. The story of his guilt was perfected by his enemies, and the complete lack of hard proof from 1483 is a hole in the story you can't ignore. Other suspects still lurk in the shadows. The treacherous Duke of Buckingham, the calculating Henry Tudor. Even the survival theories refuse to die, kept alive by the tantalizing idea that the official story is just the greatest piece of political propaganda ever written. In the end, we're right back where we started, with 2 boys who went into the Tower of London and never came out. The silence has left room for centuries of debate. The bones that might hold the final answer remain just out of reach. History rarely gives us neat endings, and the case of the princes in the tower is its most famous and most frustrating example. The evidence is on the table. The suspects have been questioned. Now, the final judgment is up to you. Picture this. It's the 12th century in the small English village of Woolpit. Life is hard, brutal, and often short. During the harvest, villagers are out in the fields when they discover 2 children huddled by a wolf pit, a deep hole dug to trap predators. They're a boy and a girl. They speak a language no one recognizes, wear clothes made of a material no one has ever seen, and strangest of all, their skin is green. This isn't just some campfire story passed down through generations. It's a historical event, recorded as fact by 2 of the most respected chroniclers of the day. For nearly 900 years, their story has baffled historians and captured our imagination, becoming one of history's most enduring and strangest mysteries. To understand the mystery, we have to go right to the source. The tale of the Green Children doesn't come from flimsy gossip, but from 2 separate accounts, written by educated men of the church around the time it supposedly happened. That fact alone elevates this tale beyond mere folklore, transforming it into a genuine historical puzzle. Our first source is William of Newburgh, writing around 1189 in his History of English Affairs. William presents the story as a marvel he felt compelled to record, even admitting he was hesitant to write about something so bizarre until he was convinced by the testimony of too many credible people to ignore it. Our second chronicler is Ralph of Coggeshall, an abbot whose monastery was much closer to Woolpit. Writing around 1220, his English chronicle adds a personal touch. Ralph claims he heard the story directly from Sir Richard de Calne, the knight who took the children into his home, giving his account a feeling of first-hand authority. Both men place the event during the reign of King Stephen, which lasted from 1135 to 1154. This period was known as the Anarchy, a brutal civil war that plunged England into chaos. Law and order had collapsed, and as one writer of the time famously put it, it felt like Christ and his saints were asleep. This backdrop of turmoil is crucial. It was a world where the unexpected really could happen. The core story told by both chroniclers is incredibly consistent. Villagers in Woolpit, Suffolk, found the brother and sister near a wolf pit. Everything about them was alien. Both accounts agree on three baffling details. Their skin had a distinct green tint, their clothes were made of a strange, unfamiliar fabric, and they spoke a language that nobody could understand. Upon their discovery, villagers were bewildered, even fearful of the children, but compassion prevailed. The frightened children were brought to the village and, according to Ralph of Coggeshall, were taken in by the local knight, Sir Richard de Calne. Here, the mystery only deepened. Though obviously starving, they refused all food. William of Newburgh writes that they were nearly fainting with hunger, but wouldn't touch bread or anything else put before them. This went on for days until someone brought in freshly picked broad beans, still on the stalk. The children immediately came to life. They grabbed the beans, but instead of opening the pods, they frantically searched the stalks. When they found nothing, they burst into tears. Once a villager showed them how to open the pods, they devoured the raw beans inside. For months, it was the only thing they would eat. Over time, they began to adapt. They learned to eat other foods, and as their diet changed, the most shocking thing about them also changed. The strange green color of their skin began to fade, and eventually, it disappeared entirely. They were then baptized into the church. But the story takes a tragic turn. The boy, who was younger and always seemed frail and listless, never fully adjusted. Not long after his baptism, he fell ill and died. His sister, however, survived. She adjusted to her new life and learned to speak English. Finally, the villagers could ask the questions they must have been dying to ask. Who are you? Where did you come from? And why were you green? Her answers only made the mystery stranger. She explained that she and her brother came from a place called St. Martin's Land, a world where the sun never shone and the light was like a constant twilight. In her land, she claimed, everyone and everything was green. When asked how they got to Woolpit, her memory was confused. She said they were herding their father's flock when they heard a loud, captivating sound, like bells. They followed the sound into a cave, wandered in darkness for a long time, and suddenly emerged into the bright sunlight of Woolpit, which terrified them. The girl's survival and her bizarre testimony have fueled centuries of debate. Her story leaves us with incredible questions. Was St. Martin's Land a real place? Or was it a child's fractured memory of a traumatic event? To unravel this, investigators have explored three main categories of theories. Theory 1. The otherworldly visitors. This theory draws on the unexplained elements of the girl's story, literally suggesting the children were beings from another world, a land of endless twilight where everyone is green sounds like something straight out of folklore. In medieval Europe, belief in a parallel fairy world was widespread. This realm, often said to be underground or just beyond our sight, was inhabited by beings who sometimes crossed into our world. The color green was heavily associated with the supernatural, and caves were often seen as portals. In this interpretation, the children were fairy beings who stumbled into our world, and the boy's death was a result of his inability to survive in it. In modern times, this theory has been updated to include aliens or beings from a subterranean, hollow Earth, with their green skin and strange clothes seen as signs of a non-human biology. Theory 2. The Flemish immigrants. A leading historical theory suggests the children were not from another world, but were simply foreigners. The lost and traumatized children of Flemish immigrants. In the 12th century, many Flemish people, from modern-day Belgium, settled in eastern England. They were skilled weavers, but also hired as mercenaries during England's wars. A major battle, the Battle of Fornham, took place in 1173, just miles from Woolpit, where thousands of Flemish mercenaries were massacred by the king's army. Proponents of this theory suggest the chroniclers, writing decades later, may have been mistaken about the exact date. If the event happened in 1173, 2 Flemish children orphaned in the conflict could have fled into the dense Thetford forest. This would explain their unfamiliar language, Flemish, and clothes, Flemish style. The girl's St. Martin's Land could be a garbled memory of her home village, Fornham St. Martin, which was located near the battle site. A land of perpetual twilight could be a child's memory of being lost deep in a dark forest. Theory 3. The medical explanation. The most iconic part of the story, the green skin, may have a scientific explanation. The most accepted medical theory is that the children suffered from hypochromic anemia, also known as chlorosis or the green sickness. This severe iron deficiency, caused by extreme malnutrition, prevents the body from producing enough red blood cells, giving the skin a pale, greenish hue. The other symptoms, extreme fatigue and weakness, perfectly matched the description of the children, especially the boy who was too frail to recover. This theory could explain the skin color regardless of the children's origins. As the girl's diet improved in her new home, her iron levels would have recovered, causing the green color to fade. The raw beans may have simply been a familiar food they trusted while starving. After centuries of debate, the case of the green children of Woolpit remains unsolved. No single theory perfectly explains every detail, and we are left with a series of lingering questions. If they were Flemish orphans, why did the girl's story describe a twilight land instead of a forest? Why did the two chroniclers, writing at different times, report the same core facts of such an unbelievable event? What was the strange, bell-like sound that she claimed led them away from their home? Ultimately, the mystery is not just about what happened, but about how it was understood. We see a real event, two terrified children appearing in a village, being interpreted through the lens of a world steeped in superstition and folklore. Their true story, whatever it was transformed into a legend. The legend of the green children endures because it sits at the crossroads of history and myth. It challenges our understanding of the past and asks us how we respond to the unknown. Was this a genuine encounter with another world, a folktale that took on a life of its own, or the tragic story of two refugee children whose suffering made them seem alien? The mystery remains. On a cobbled street in Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophäa steps out of her home. It is July 14th, 1518. There's no music, no festival. There is only the oppressive heat. And then, she starts to move. This isn't a happy jig or a graceful waltz. Her arms flail. Her body twists and convulses to a rhythm only she can hear. Her feet stomp against the packed earth, a frantic, desperate beat. For no reason anyone can see, she has started to dance. And the most terrifying part? She can't stop. This isn't a choice. It's a compulsion, an involuntary trance, a mania that has seized her body. For one woman on a quiet street in Strasbourg, the apocalypse has begun, and it has a horrifying, relentless beat. To understand the dance, you first have to understand the world it began in. Picture a blistering hot July in the city of Strasbourg. The air is thick, not just with summer heat, but with the smell of poverty and a constant hum of anxiety. Life here is fragile. For years, famine has been a constant, unwelcome guest. Disease, from old horrors like leprosy to a terrifying new sickness called syphilis, stalks the narrow streets. Even faith is starting to crack, as new religious ideas were challenging centuries of religious doctrine, adding to the spiritual turmoil. This is a city on a knife's edge. The people are stretched to their absolute breaking point. They're desperate, they're starving, and they are deeply, deeply superstitious. But this wasn't just a hypothetical fear. The horror of a dancing plague had been seen before. In 1374, a similar mania had erupted in the town of Aachen, Germany. It saw hundreds of people seized by the same agonizing compulsion, dancing for days on end. This St. John's dance, as it was called, spread through the Rhine Valley, creating a historical memory of a curse that could force people to dance themselves to death. So, in 1518, an event like this could only be seen through one lens: the supernatural. They believed in a vengeful God and saints who could inflict terrible curses on sinners. And one saint in particular was known for this exact kind of affliction: Saint Vitus. The legend was powerful. It was said he could curse those who angered him, forcing them into a wild, uncontrollable dance. To a mind steeped in this folklore, an affliction like this wasn't a medical problem. It was a divine sentence. For the first few moments, Frau Trophäa was probably just a strange sight. Her horrified husband rushed to her side, but his words were lost. She was locked in a trance, her eyes glassy and unfocused. This went on for days, somewhere between 4 and 6 solid days of nearly non-stop, convulsive dancing. The sun beat down on her. Night fell. She danced until her body gave out, only to be pulled back to her feet after a few hours of shallow rest. She was, in full view of her terrified neighbors, dancing herself to death. Frau Trophäa's dance was the spark. As the first week of her ordeal ended, others began to feel a strange twitch, a compulsion in their own limbs. They too began to dance. Within a week, more than 30 people had joined her. By August, the number of dancers had swelled to an almost unbelievable 400. The narrow streets of Strasbourg were transformed into a nightmarish, open-air asylum. Hundreds of men, women, and even some children, all moving at once in chaotic, spasmodic convulsions. Contemporary accounts say many screamed in pain and begged for mercy, fully aware, but trapped in bodies that had betrayed them. Their feet, swollen and battered, began to bleed, and still, they danced. Death was a constant partner. People would simply collapse from strokes, heart attacks, or pure exhaustion. Some reports claimed that at the plague's peak, as many as 15 people were dying each day. Facing a crisis spiraling out of control, the city council met with the city's physicians. They dismissed any supernatural causes, declaring this a natural disease caused by hot blood. The prescribed cure was what turned the tragedy into a catastrophe. The physicians reasoned the dancers needed to sweat the fever out. The cure for the dancing, they concluded, was more dancing. Authorities cleared out guild halls and built a large wooden stage in the horse market. Most bizarrely, and perhaps tragically, they hired professional musicians. Pipes and drums were brought in to provide a constant, pounding beat. The result was a horrifying, state-sponsored disaster. The relentless music was a new level of hell for the dancers. For onlookers, the effect was even worse. By creating an official city event, the city council legitimized the phenomenon. The sight of the frenzied movements, set to a hypnotic beat, drew even more people into the mania. The authorities had accidentally created a perfect feedback loop of mass hysteria. For 500 years, we've been asking how this could possibly happen. The first theory is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a mold that grows on damp rye, the main grain for bread. It contains psychoactive chemicals and can cause violent muscle spasms and hallucinations. However, the world's leading expert on the plague, John Waller, argues against it. Ergotism is debilitating and unlikely to produce coordinated dancing for days. It also causes gangrene by cutting off blood flow, a symptom never mentioned in the Strasbourg accounts. A second theory suggests a heretical religious cult. This is also unlikely. The powerful church never condemned the dancers as heretics. They consistently described the dancing as an involuntary illness. The victims were seen as sufferers in agony, not joyful worshippers. This brings us to the most widely accepted explanation: mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria. Championed by Waller, this theory argues the plague was a physical outbreak of extreme psychological distress. The people of 16th century Strasbourg lived under unimaginable hardship and spiritual terror. They genuinely believed an angry Saint Vitus could curse them with a dancing plague. In this high-stress environment, the mind can enter a dissociative trance, and psychological trauma can manifest as physical symptoms. The legend of Saint Vitus provided the exact script for how that trauma would look. After weeks of their more dancing policy failing, the panicked city council did a complete 180. They banned public music and pivoted back to a spiritual explanation. The clergy took charge, declaring the dancers were in the grip of Saint Vitus. Authorities rounded up the afflicted and sent them to a shrine dedicated to the very saint they believed had cursed them. Frau Trophea had been sent there weeks earlier. At the shrine, priests performed what was essentially a full-scale exorcism. Remarkably, it seemed to work. Whether it was the power of the ritual, removal from the toxic city atmosphere, or the mania burning itself out, the dancers began to recover. By early September, the plague had subsided. The fact that a spiritual intervention worked serves as powerful evidence that the plague's origins were rooted in the mind and in belief. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's most bizarre and unsettling episodes. For a few terrifying months, Strasbourg became the stage for an epidemic with no virus, spread not by a cough, but by fear and suggestion. Was it a freak poisoning, a secret ritual, or was it, as the evidence suggests, a terrifying explosion of mass hysteria, a perfect storm of extreme stress, deep-seated superstition, and social contagion? We may never know for sure. But the story leaves us with one last nagging question. We may have moved past the belief in vengeful saints, but we have our own modern anxieties. In an age of social media, viral misinformation, and online panic, are we really so immune to this kind of thing? Or is the next dancing plague just waiting for a different kind of music to start? The dancers of Strasbourg stopped moving 500 years ago, but the questions they leave behind still echo today.